The automatic stipple pen. I have done a review on this before, and spoilers, I gave it a good review. However, I haven't used it since, and I'm not too sure why. So I decided to go back and dive deeper into the pros and cons of this pen. For this artwork, I wanted to choose a subject that I'm familiar with, so I decided to go with this skull reference. I have actually used this reference before, but this just allows me to focus more on the technique with the pen. I prefer to work from dark to light, and this approach allows me to experiment with the pen at the beginning. If I use the wrong technique, or if it's not looking right, these areas can be darkened up and those errors will be covered. The pen doesn't vibrate too much, so it's easy to hold, and I don't feel like I'm losing control of the placement of the tip. What does feel odd, however, is holding the pen so upright while shading. As I normally use pencils or brushes, I'm used to holding them quite horizontal as I fill in large areas. The other thing that takes some getting used to is how the pen needs to be held away from the paper to allow it to do the stippling. The pen needs to hover over the paper as it pushes the nib down to create the dots, so that means the pen needs to have some distance from the paper. It feels a bit strange, and getting the distance consistent takes some practice. The pen positioning may seem annoying, but it's something that is easy to get used to. The first major issue I have with this pen is the battery life. It doesn't seem to hold a lot of charge, and you can feel the pen start to slow down and struggle as the battery gets low. This changes the feel of the pen. As I feel like I'm getting more consistent, the dots start coming slower and slower, meaning I need to change my technique. I need to start moving the pen slower to match the slower speed. Once the battery dies, I'm left just waiting for it to recharge before I can continue working. The pen can be used while it's plugged in and charging, so at least it's an avoidable situation. However, I didn't really like this option. I feel as if the cord is in the way, and as my PowerPoint is lower than my desk, the cord is pulling down, creating extra weight on the back of the pen. The cord is decently long, but again in my setup it's not long enough to comfortably reach all of the areas of my artwork. I opted to wait for it to charge, so I didn't have to deal with the cable. Back to technique. My approach for shading is similar to how I would with pencil, but just more time consuming. I block in the darkest area first, and then the lighter surrounding tones. As some of these areas are very dark, I go over all of those tones together and darken them together. This creates depth in the shading, as it helps to maintain a larger tonal range to imply detail. Hand stippling is a very time-consuming process. However, just because this pen is automatic, don't think you're going to be a stippling pro racer when using it. Yes, it's quicker, but it still takes time to build up the dots. This particular pen has two speeds, slow and fast. I definitely feel more comfortable with the slow speed, as I have more control and I have time to figure out where I want to move to next. The high speed seems like it really wants to slam down on the paper, so it leaves bigger, darker dots. It also feels more aggressive. I can see how it would be useful to really darken up larger areas quickly, but I prefer to slowly build everything up. There's less room for error that way. I did end up using the higher speed to black out the mouth, and it helps to keep that consistent texture that the rest of the artwork has. However, I don't think I can recommend this setting for areas outside of blacking out. As I worked through the piece, I kept going back into areas to make things darker to up the contrast. I think things are dark enough, but when I add more of my mid-tones in, I realise I need more darkness to separate the tones better. This is something that happens when I'm using pencil too, so not necessarily a problem with the tool, but I find it is happening more than it normally does for me. But that could just be due to inexperience with the pen. Something I noticed while I worked was how inconsistent the pen can be. Part of that could be due to user error, part of that is the battery issue I mentioned before. As I already talked about, the pen needs to be held quite upright, which makes sense and is not really a problem in itself. The problem comes from the mechanism itself. As I work, my hand naturally will angle a bit, unless I lock out my arm and try to move like a robot, which isn't a very comfortable or efficient way to work. Changing angle, even slightly, can cause the inner workings of the pen to shift, which in turn changes the rate of the dots. Once that changes, I need to change how I work, or the pen nib can linger out for longer and start creating small lines instead. So while I'm trying my best to get consistent dots, sometimes I feel like I'm fighting against the pen to get it to work. As well as changing the timing for the dots, it also changes how much power the pen is using. So on one angle it feels like it's really slamming the paper and getting darker dots, while other times it feels like it's barely brushing over the paper and it's leaving next to no ink behind. With the way the pen works, it's really easy to get straight lines of dots. This is a good thing if you like the effect and want to create really clean and uniform dot work. I can see the value of doing that, and I use that to my advantage when creating the little cracks and holes in the skull. But overall, I wanted more organic and random dots for this piece. I did that by moving in more of a circular motion or masking those lines by doing a cross-hatching motion. I was able to get the effect I wanted by doing this. Is this method faster than hand stippling? Probably, but it still took me quite a long time. I have over 3 hours of footage, and I didn't record everything. I don't think the piece is overly big either. It's done on an A5 piece of paper. I don't really hand stipple, so I don't know how long this would have taken me without the auto pen. A lot longer, I would assume. You still need patience to build up the dark areas and to blend between sections. Alright, let's take a look at the final artwork. Here are my final thoughts on the automatic stipple pen. It does work as intended, and it helps speed up the process of dot work. There are some downsides, like the battery and the inconsistency. It does have a specific look to it compared to hand stippling, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Overall, I think it is easy to pick up and get drawing with, and makes stippling easier. If you plan on doing a lot of stipple work, I would recommend it. However, if it's something you just want to dabble and have fun with, for its price point, I would suggest just starting with hand stippling.